Thank you everyone for coming by tonight for this, and also thanks for inviting me to speak. And for the folks who stop by later on Twitch or some other platform, hopefully you enjoy the content. We're going to talk tonight about form validation in VueJs using vValidate. Okay, so, all right. Hold on. All right, so a little bit of background about myself first. Hold on. I have over 30 years of software development experience. I have a company called Clearly Innovative, which I started about 12 years ago, which is a web and mobile development firm. We started out doing mostly mobile development, and now it's about a 50-50 split between mobile development and web development. Our primary platform of choice is we use Ionic Framework for their web components. We're building out our mobile UIs and more building out our website UIs. I also have taught Angular, Vue, and React with Ionic Framework through a technology initiative for my other company. And I have a YouTube channel and a blog channel where I post about web and mobile development, specifically React and VueJs. And I always include Ionic because that's kind of what we work with every day in my company. Just a little bit of a touch on Ionic Framework for those who aren't familiar with it, and its integration with VueJs. Ionic released their mobile UI components, which had previously only worked on Angular. They released support for Vue and React over the last year. I've been working with the Vue components for the last approximately 2 years. It's just the way that I explain it to folks who aren't really familiar with it. It's like the best way to look at it is like it's their UI components similar to what is it? Vuetify, and I think Quasar has components. It's similar to that, except they're focused on mobile UI. More and more, Ionics kind of move them towards you can use them for websites or mobile development. The other thing that we get from using Ionic Framework is they have Capacitor. Capacitor allows you to write your code in VueJS and deploy to mobile devices and get access to the underlying mobile framework. vValidate is what I use for my form validation. The links provided here, and also I'll provide all of the links so that they can be posted with the videos. It provides easy customizable form validation. It works with UI components. So if you want to use it with whatever UI components that you want to use, it easily integrates with that. They've recently, about 4 months ago, 3-4 months ago, they released Vue 3 support. Most of what I show you will work with Vue 2 or Vue 3. It also integrates with Yup for those who aren't familiar with it. It's a validation framework for more validation, for more complex validation schemas. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is covered and that you can do with vValidate, but I'm not going to touch on that because I think I have 3 or 4 sample projects that I want to try and get through to cover the basics. But you can check out the vValidate website and then also my YouTube channel for more content that covers everything you can do with vValidate. So this is what I'm going to try to get through today in the time that we have, which is a basic integration of vValidate in a simple Vue form. The next one, we will integrate Yup to show you how to use Yup for form validation and creating schemas with Yup. Then we will show how to break your forms up into smaller components. So sometimes you have complex forms that could theoretically go on for pages, and you want to manage the state and the validation across that. If you're coding and following best practices, you would kind of break your form up into smaller components and manage components individually. vValidate provides a nice framework for managing form elements that are in separate components, or creating your own customized input components that you might want to use in your form. And then at the end, I will show how vValidate worked with the UI component, and that'll be an example with Ionic Framework. Okay. So for anyone who wants to follow along, here are the links for the code that I'm going to walk through. This whole video is going to be really me walking through source code examples. I thought we might have a few more people on board because the idea was to kind of do more of a Q&A as I'm walking through the code instead of just kind of walking through line by line. So if anybody's on and they have questions, you know, feel free to chime in so that I can explain the code that I'm walking through. And I'm going to get, unless there's any questions right now, I'm just going to hop straight into the code. So this is the basic one here. Let's see if I can get this to work properly. Okay. Can you just confirm that this screen is still being shared so everyone can see this?
Yeah, I'm able to see your screen.
Okay, great. And I'm just going to do a font size check. So if the font size isn't big enough, let me know and I'll kind of zoom it in a bit. So.
Yeah, I think this should be fine.
Okay, I'm going to assume that most people on the call have a basic understanding of Vue, so I'll just kind of quickly walk through the layout of the application and then spend most of my time focusing on the integration of vValidate. This is an app, so for those who don't know, this is Code Sandbox. Code Sandbox allows you to build React, Vue, Angular, kind of pretty much any kind of JavaScript application and more inside of an online container. And so the links that are included in this presentation, this is full working source code that you can go to, check the project out in the cloud inside of Code Sandbox. That's why I did the work inside of here. This application is based off the default Vue CLI. So in main TS, we create the application, the overall application and mount it. And what I've done is I've kept, to try to keep this simple, all of the code I've just put inside of app view. Ignore the squiggly lines there, some ESLint errors that I couldn't figure out how to make go away 100%. But let's kind of walk through the code and explain what's going on here. First of all, to get started, you need to import vValidate. For what we're doing here, we're just going to work with the form element, the field element, and the error messages. I think the best way to start is to just kind of show how you lay out your forms to get the benefit of them. So here we're using the form component that wraps your whole form. So it's replaced the HTML form. So you have your vValidate form. And then the next thing you have is you have your specific fields. So the field replaces what you would normally see as the input type. So normally this would be an input element with the type of text. And then the last component that we're using here is this error message component. So the way that vValidate works is that after you kind of lay out your I was about to say your HTML, but after you kind of lay out your form, that pretty much handles the bulk of the setup that you need to do for basic form validation. There's some classes that are here that I've just created to kind of try to make this look a little bit better. But other than setting up the form, defining your fields, and defining your error messages, that's the bulk of the work that you need to do to get it set up. Across the top here, what happens is on form submit, we're going to have our function called handle submit, which will get called. Handle submit is down here inside of my setup on my component. This function only gets called if the form is valid. If the form is not valid, this function will never get called. So I'm able to kind of manage the attributes, properties, or values that I'm getting back from my form here inside of handle submit. As soon as it gets inside of handle submit, I know that everything is valid and I'm good to go. The other point that I'd like to mention, and one of the benefits that I find of using tools like this, if you notice, there's no V model anywhere inside of my form. So vValidate manages your form, for what I like to say is your form state for you. So it simplifies that level of complexity. Normally you would probably have here inside of your setup some refs or something to kind of manage the form state independently, and you'd have to kind of figure out how to structure it properly to get it to the shape that you want it to be to properly persist in your database or whatever your backend storage might be. vValidate manages the state for you, so that's kind of nice. Is there anything else inside the code other than handle submit? Oh yes, in this first example, I've written just the basic is required validator. And what it does is it takes a value in. You return true if whatever your validation function wants to do to make sure that the data that it receives is valid. Otherwise, it will return whatever you want your error message to be. The way that the rules are set, you can see here on all these examples, there's this attribute that's bound to this is required function. So what's going to happen is the value from each one of these input fields is going to get passed to the is required function. If it doesn't meet the validation requirement, then an error will be associated with this element. And then this error message component, which also comes from vValidate, will allow you to render the error message. So what I will do is, the way it's currently set up now, the on submit, when I click this login button, will attempt to trigger a validation. So if I click it now, you can see, so I'll kind of explain what you're seeing on the screen. So this is required that's listed here on the bottom. This is coming from this error message component. So it's rendering the error message associated with the field that has the name that is passed in as the attribute for error message here. And then down here on the bottom, in case you wanted to get access to all of the errors that are associated with the form, I've just kind of created this debug element, or just a way to kind of display the errors that are associated with the form. If you come up to the top here, the form has a slot, and in the slot you can get access to errors that are relative to the form. And so I'm taking this value, I'm stringifying it so that I can render here, and you can see the results on the bottom. We can just enter some test data here, and you can see that the error messages have gone. It's updated to indicate that there's no more errors, only the password's the last error. And then once I enter the password, all my errors are gone. And then now if I hit the submit button, you can see it has returned all the values that are associated with the form, not formatted, with a structure that's based on the name that you assigned to each one of the form fields, and that you get your data back appropriately. Let me just fix this so we can show it's different. Let me submit again, and then you get your data. So it's pretty nice that out of the box you get the basic, as I said, management of your state, which is your fields. This is a straightforward validator that you can write. I believe vValidate has some out-of-the-box validators that you can kind of download from them also. In the next section, I'll show how to use Yup, because it's kind of been my tool of choice for validation. That's pretty much it for a basic validator. This form data here, I don't think I ever actually used it. It was left over from another example that I wanted to. No, actually, I'm using it to display the results here on the bottom. So this is when you execute the submit and you get the values back, I was just setting it to this local property so that we can display the values down here on the bottom. So this is a basic form validation done with vValidate. It's, like I said, it's just 3 different components that you have to add. It's a minor modification to what your normal UI would look like. Your normal form UI, as I said, would be the HTML elements for form, and kind of your input tags that would be spread across here. I'm going to kind of pause before I move on to the next example to see if there's any questions or any comments that anybody has. I don't have the chat up. I don't know how to keep them both open. Hold on. More chat. Okay, I'll just put that over here on the side, and then for anyone who's here, I will. This is the first. So I pasted the link to the first code example in the chat for anybody who wants to take a look at it. Whoever ST is, thanks for joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to chime in. And now let me get back to the presentation. So that was the basic form validation with VueValidate. No need for your own V model. It handles it for you, and you rolled your own validation. And so now we're going to move on to integrating Yup. Let's go to that example here. And then let me just do one more thing. I wanted to make sure I included this here. Yup is not, for those who aren't familiar with Yup, it's not tied to VueJS. It can be used with React, it can be used with Angular, it can also be used with plain VueJS. And I'll also kind of embed the link for that here. And then let's get back to our, all right. So we are back to our application. The only difference, so just to let you know, the difference here is that where's my package? We've added additional dependency of Yup. That's been added to the project now. And so what we've done here is we've removed the is required, and we're going to handle our form validation using Yup. So the first thing that we had to do is we've imported Yup. And then what you need to do with Yup is you need to create, let me make this a little bit bigger. You need to create a schema which represents your data model that's being used in your form. And so what we've done is we have our, actually it's not necessarily in order. Would be nice, hold on. First, last, email. I can't change this because it's frozen, so we'll just leave it as it is. So the first thing you do is you create the kind of what I like to call the shape of your data, which is a Yup object. And it's a key value pair, with the key being the name that is associated with the input field. And then you use a series of Yup, looks like they're kind of string together functions to kind of define how you would validate it and what the type is of the object. And so you'll see here, we're saying that our first name is a string and that it's required. Our last name is a string, it's required. And then there's specific types that it also supports. Email is one of them. I think it's phone. Oh, I'm not going to do this. I can't modify this. Sorry. There's different types that you can define what your value is. Also in the next example, I'll show you can also create more complex objects. So you could have nested objects inside of your schema. But the whole idea is that you set up your schema, and VueValidate will use the schema when it attempts to validate the data instead of you writing your own requires. So we've set up our schema up at the top here. The other thing that I've done is I want to validate on Blur. So I've imported configure from VueValidate. There's some configuration you can do, and there's different settings on You can validate on blur, you can validate on change, and there's a couple of others that are also included in the YUP documentation that you can take a look at. But blur was sufficient for what we're trying to accomplish here. You can see that we've removed the is required. That's the, and I think that's the only change that we've made kind of to our setup code down here on the bottom. So let's scroll. Another thing I wanted to show that's different is that we have control of our error messages. So you can see here on the password for the required error message, it's the password must be required. I mean, the password is a required field, but since there's some other validation for each one of the validations, I can specify the error message. And so for here, since the password needs to be at least 8 characters, I'm specifying that if you've entered something for a password, you won't get this error message. But if the password is less than 8 characters, then this error message will be displayed. So that's something nice you can do here. Since I haven't specified an error message up here on required, you'll just get the default error message. So you see it's getting just first, it's just using the actual name of the field and just saying, is a required field, is a required field. But if you look down here on password, you see it's getting my customized error message. And then I think as I start to type, let's see. Since it's not 8 characters, I'm now getting this must be 8 characters error message. So that's another nice touch that they've added, and the ability for you to kind of manage it all here in the schema, I think simplifies it, makes the code easier to manage, and also just easier to read. So now we've talked about how we've set up our schema using YUP. Let's see how we actually use it in our form. So, excuse me. So here in our form, we've made a little change. What we've done is we've added this binding of validation schema and provided it the name of our schema to validate the whole form. And also, just as a note, using the Vue 3 kind of setup approach, I've had to return the schema from my setup function so I can get access to it in my template. So here we've identified that we want this form. It's being validated against the schema. The name of the schema is form schema. And then as you can see, I've removed the required from all of my form fields. So now all you need is just the name of the field and the type if you want to specify what the type of the field is. And that is all that needs to be done to create your schema using YUP. So let's try to test our form a bit and see what we get. Let me refresh this. Okay, we're taking the same approach for displaying the values here on the bottom. So if there's errors, and then also on submit, we can get the values from the form data. So let me just enter. You can see that on blur from the field, it's kind of updating the specific error message. Let me take that out of there. Just down here. Well, let's just take some of these out so we can see the validation. So we're getting our error message here is properly displaying the error messages, and then also in our overall errors object, we're getting our errors displayed. And then now we have no errors. We click submit and we get our values returned to us. So this was just kind of the next step in using vValidate for your forms. And if you wanted to create a more complex structure, I think that's where you'd start to move towards using a tool like Yup for validation. Since we got a small group and I'm moving along a lot faster than I wanted to, I'm going to kind of change up order a bit. And go through the walkthrough with Ionic Framework to kind of show you, for the folks out there who are using something like, I always say the name wrong, Vuetify or Quasar, or in my example, using Ionic Framework, how you can still use vValidate to manage form validation there. Okay. So this is the original, the first example that we showed. Sorry about that. Yeah, how do I shrink this? There we go. So this is the first form that I showed, but here we've done it with Ionic Framework. Just a couple of things here that are different to get Ionic Framework integrated here. We have to import Ionic View. We attach it to our app at startup. There's a bunch of CSS that you need by default with Ionic that we've included. And then that's about it. So if we now go over to our app view, we can just kind of walk through the structure. All Ionic apps are wrapped in this Ion app component. All Ionic pages are wrapped in a page, and then the content sits inside of an Ion content component. There's some default classes, some utility classes that you get from Ionic. That's what you're seeing up here. And then kind of to get this nice, clean looking UI, you kind of wrap each one of your elements inside of an Ion item, and then an Ion label. And then here's where you start to see the difference of how it's done. So what you do is, when using a custom component or custom UI with vValidate, you provide the custom input element as a child to the field component. And you specify the slot, so the slot is called field, and then you bind your custom element, or in this form, Ionic element, to the field so that it knows that this is the slot that it needs to be rendered in. We're still using the default is required to manage our rules, but in theory, we could remove this also and go with the Yup approach that we used last time and do the validation up here at the top. But it really is pretty straightforward to use any third-party UI, or even potentially roll your own UI components and still get the form validation that you're looking for. It all just kind of comes together pretty neatly. So let's just kind of see how this works. And then also here, I didn't put the proper styling on it, but you're seeing you're getting your error messages here on the end. Everything else is working the same as before. Then we get our nice structured data, our errors managed appropriately, and like I said, you get the benefit of getting a nice, if you're using some sort of UI components, you can just integrate them nice and neatly with vValidate. Okay. And then the last one that we're going to show. And so this last, can't do that. This last example, basically, we're going to continue to use Yup for a validation, but we're going to break the forms into components. And this kind of me looking into this came from a specific. Right, let me get this code open. Okay. This challenge came from a specific issue that we ran into with a project that I'm working on at my company, Clearly Innovative. So we're working on a very form-intensive application, and what we found were that there were components of the forms that were being used in multiple forms across the application, and we wanted to leverage reuse across the application, but we also wanted to continue to leverage the form validation technology that we use. So the idea was that the specific example that we had was address. I mean, that's a common example that a lot of people are familiar with, where you might have a form that has first name, last name, email, then it has a home address and a business address. The easy way to do it might be to kind of basically duplicate street address 1, street address 2, city, state, zip, and then in the exact same form, just do it again. Business address 1, business address 2, business, city, business, state, business, zip. That will work, but since we're trying to find a component-based way to do our work, we would really like to have an address component and have an address component that can just get dropped inside of any form and automatically still continue to support validation based on the higher level form. And so what we've done here in a simple way to show this working is I've broken out and called this, it's kind of a fake example, but it shows what we're trying to do, is I've pulled out the first name and the last name into a separate component called demographic information. And for now, it's just your first name and last name, but theoretically, it could be a bunch of other data that you might want to capture on multiple forms, and you just want to write one component that captures the demographic information. But you also want this form to be able to have and support validation wherever you drop it in, on whatever form it is. And the other thing is you also want to be able to structure the shape of the data. So just to show you what it looks like in the back end, password. So you can see how now we have our data structured differently. So this demographic information is stored inside of an object in my form called personal. So I could, in theory, have this demographic information component multiple times inside my form and have a different key that's associated with each time it's utilized, but still get the benefits of vValidate, Yup, and form validation, plus the state management. Because like I said, vValidate is providing me this data shaped exactly the way I want it, so I can determine my personal information from the rest of my information. And so there's a couple of tricks, I don't want to call it tricks, but things that I've done to kind of make this work. Let's start with the component specifically. What you'll see inside of the component is it's not wrapped inside of a form, because the parent form will manage the fact that it's wrapped in a form. But what we've done is actually, let me go back to the top. What we've done here at the top is, here's my component called demographic info. We pass in what I'm calling a prefix, and the prefix is defining the key that the data from this component will get mapped to. So I pass in this prefix, it's named personal. If you go to our demographic information, see what view 3, we have it specified as a property prefix that gets passed in. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we appropriately name the form fields using the prefix that was passed in, so that when there's when and if there's multiple instances of this component included inside of the application or form, we can identify the pieces of data based on the prefix that was passed in. And like I said, this is just an example that I've created. This is an artificial example that I've created to just show a way to reuse components, control how the data associated with the component is structured, and how you could use multiple instances of the component inside the same form and still separate and control where the data is placed and how it's validated. So we pass the prefix in, and we use the prefix to provide the name, and also that name is needed for the validation. And then that's pretty much it. The other thing we do is we describe the shape of the data, i.e. the schema, for it inside of this component. And so then what this component does is it will export the schema, and then it will also export the component. So now if we go over to our app view, you can see here that we've imported 2 things from my demographic info component. We've imported the schema, and we've imported the component demographic info. And up here on the top, here's where we've used demographic info. We pass in a property personal info, but the other part that pulls it all together is the schema. So what we've done here is, I didn't get a chance to figure out how to properly use the prefix constant here, but what we've done is we've taken the original schema, which is the schema for the first part, and Yup allows you to concatenate additional objects onto the schema. And so what we've done is we said, let's take the schema that we got from our demographic info component, and let's combine it to my overall login schema with the appropriate prefix of personal. So now when I use my login schema up here at the top of my form, the schema knows how to validate the fields that are inside of here, and it knows how to validate the fields that are at the top level of my form. So the email and the password. Let me unfreeze this for a minute to kind of better show what I'm talking about. Let's unfreeze this. We have some time. So first of all, you can see how I got my data correctly here. And let's see, if I remove the last name here, it's validating that appropriately. And it's validating it based on the schema from the component. And this is also wrong here. This should say first. And giving you the expected results. But if I wanted to, now this is live coding, so bear with me if this doesn't work properly. I want to say personal, and let's say spouse. Let's try it like that. So I've now created another element on my page. And I should be able to, it should be as simple as coming down here. Let's cross my fingers if this works. And concat. One, two, 1, 2. And then this is spouse. And you can see that it's tracking the difference between the 2 components and the data for the 2 components. Let me just make this a little bit clearer by doing this. Let's say So we have the two separate sections, the personal and the spouse, and then I'm able to Aaron Saunders, and then my wife, Andrea Saunders. And then when I log in, I get my data shaped exactly the way I want. With the separate information, it's also validated separately. The state is managed for us, and we get our data and everything just the way we kind of, for lack of a better word, expect it to be. A couple other things I want to point out is I'm getting the data at the end on the submit, but also up here on another thing you do on the form is you could actually get the data here. I think it's values. And then, so if I go, well, we'd have to move, if we then take this and we move it inside of the form. We can now get our data in real time instead of waiting for the submit, which is another, so now when I log in, you can see I'm able to see what data is currently in the form, but not all of it. Before, the only way you were able to get the data was on the submit. So this is another thing that I had to address with the current project. Because we needed the ability to save the form to the database in an unsubmitted state. And so the ability to get access to the form model, even if it isn't valid, was critical. And so, you know, being able to use the slot values up here provided us the ability to support that. I've been talking for about 45 minutes, and I think I've covered everything that I want to cover for today, plus my throat is kind of going out on me. The slides are here. There's some more videos here that are on my YouTube channel, which goes into some more details about nested forms, goes in the ability to create dynamic field arrays and have them validated. And then here's personal links for myself, my company's website, a link to my blogs and videos, which is the FIWIC, which is Future is Written in Code. And then my blog is at Dev2, my YouTube channel and my Twitter. And, you know, that's it for me, unless there's any specific questions about the content that I covered. I don't know, I'm certain the video will get posted. I can, you know, we can have a chat afterwards and figure out where to post these slides so that you can have access to the slides and all the links. The source code and these projects that are up here on Code Sandbox are publicly accessible. So once you get access to the presentation, you should be able to get access to all the source code also. And feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions around this content. And I'm going to turn it back over to the host at this point.